Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Her Song is a Sin, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Lou1, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by me, Britt. Her Song is a Sin. Chapter 25. Sitting at the table, Raelle and Tally's intensity had the others looking at one another nervously. They had never heard Raelle use that tone before now. The closest time Porter could recall hearing the bodyguard use that tone was when she used it at him after he'd attacked her the night of Beltane. This cowboy has seen a lot in his life, and very few moments struck fear like she did that night. He'd had that image of her icy stare engraved in his mind since. However, that night was nothing compared to what he saw just now. What was even more disturbing was how easily that normally cheerful and friendly redhead met Raelle's gaze and gave a single nod. Porter saw her eyes reflect the same unspoken agreement. He was just glad not to be the target. After a moment, the tension was released as Raelle sat back in her chair and looked at them. "I'm heading back with Tally when she leaves, and I want the three of you to stay here." Porter and Byron nodded, but Salem met Raelle's gaze. They all looked back at Ray in unison. "Absolutely not," the musician said. "Where you go, I go. It's not safe for you to go back. Not until this is done." Byron's head just fixated on Ray, then finally he chimed in. "This is like in every horror movie, cop story. They always say stay together. Am I right?" "It's not safe for you either," Scylla reasoned. Raelle scoffed. "I'll be fine." "I don't like it," Scylla said. Byron looked at Scylla in agreement, but kept from saying anything more. He knew he just wanted to support his sister right now. "You promised me you would do as I asked if I stayed on as your bodyguard," Raelle said, meeting the musician's azure gaze. "I'm asking you to stay here while I go back with Tally and end this thing." Scylla wanted to protest more, but the blonde was right. She had promised Raelle she'd follow her instructions down to the letter. Finally, she sighed and then nodded her head. The artist watched Raelle speak and could only wonder what plan his sister was coming up with, because it will be a cold day in hell if she thinks a ram's horn will be held back from protecting family. Nope, nope, nope. Porter added, "I don't think it's a good idea for you to go alone." In truth, he knew he didn't have the experience the two women sitting before him had. He didn't relish the idea of hunting someone who was perfectly capable of hunting him back. The reality was, he was scared, but he knew he had to support his friends, his family, in any way possible. "I won't be alone, right, Tal?" Raelle said, nodding to her longtime partner, friend, and sister. "I'm with you," Tally confirmed with a sharp glance and a smirk to her sister. The agent was surprised she even needed to ask. Raelle met Porter's gaze and smiled. "Besides, I need you here watching over Scylla, just in case." "Just in case what?" The musician kept repeating those words. That phrase her bodyguard used just kept ringing in her mind. Just in case things went south? Raelle got hurt, maybe killed? Scylla was about to protest again when Tally spoke. "I'll contact the team once we're in the air." "Good," Raelle said, already thinking of strategic maneuvers to capture this psycho as quickly as possible. Seeing that the group conversation was essentially over, Porter shifted in his chair and then spoke to break the tension. "Okay. I think I'm going to hang out with Jasper then." Security guard was eager to get out of the house. "Maybe we can take another ride?" "That's a good idea, Porter," Raelle said. "In fact, why don't you all go for a ride while Telly and I talk?" "Sounds fun," Byron said. desperate to be anywhere else after their admissions to the agent. He slapped the table a couple of times when he stood as a cue for the others to come along. Scylla frowned. "I think I'll pass." "You sure, sis?" Byron asked as he got up from the dining table. Porter joined the artist and looked down at his friend. "Do you want us to stay here?" "No, I'll be good. Go on. Have fun," Scylla said, with a smile and shaking her head. "You two go see the horses. I think I'd rather just stay in the house." Raelle looked at the musician, her pale blue eyes softening as Scylla's azure gaze met hers. "We're going to get the one who's doing this." It didn't matter how much Raelle had softened her gaze. The intensity with which she spoke made a shiver run down Scylla's spine. She had no doubt that Raelle was truly intended to hunt down the person who threatened them. Telly spoke from across the table. "They will be arrested and held accountable for their crimes." "Yeah," Raelle agreed, and forced herself to give Scylla a reassuring smile. Scylla stood from the table. "I'm going upstairs to read." Telly and Raelle nodded their goodbyes and watched as Scylla left the dining area. She could feel their eyes on her as she walked away. She knew that they'd both just lied to her. Porter had just finished helping Byron with tacking up Winston when the sound of approaching boots thudding on the floor caught their attention. Quinn turned the corner and offered them a smile. "Y'all going on another trail ride with Ray?" "Nah, it's just us today," Porter said, and then thought that he probably should get permission. Sheepishly, he added, "If that's okay with you?" "Sure, hon," Quinn said. "Just be sure to take a saddlebag with a gun and a first aid kit." "Why do we need a gun?" Porter asked, genuinely curious. He'd noticed Ray had been carrying on their trail ride the other day, but he just assumed it was about keeping Scylla safe. The more he thought about it, though, he couldn't recall her carrying it any other time since they'd come to the log house. "I know you saw the bear in the living room," Quinn said. Byron's eyes widened. "Smokey Bear?" as he mimicked the stuffed bear stance. The old woman snorted back a laugh. "Yeah, Ray took him down near the old staff house." Byron blenched, remembering them being there just the other day without a care in the world. "It's not likely you're going to run into one this time of day, but you need to be ready just in case," Quinn said, attempting to call the nervous artist. "I really don't like guns," Byron mumbled. "I'll carry it," Porter said, waving his hand in the air. "You don't have to like them, but you need to know how to use them," the wise woman said loud enough for the both of them to hear. "Think about it. What if you get hurt? What's he going to do then?" Quinn asked the blonde as she jerked her head towards the artist. "Then I'd run to get help," Byron said. Quinn put her hands on her hips and shook her head. "You boys both need some learning in self-defense and first aid." She told them to wait for her by the main entrance, and she stalked off. 20 minutes later, she joined them on a buckskin quarter horse she called Whiskey. He was packing several bags. "Come on," Quinn said, turning her horse towards the drive. "I'm going to teach y'all a few things." Porter and Byron followed the older woman, one excited to learn and the other nervous about the whole thing. The blonde smiled from ear to ear as they trotted behind Whiskey. All Byron could do was roll his eyes at his boyfriend's excitement for today's lesson. Helen weaved her way through various ferns and vines to the back of the hothouse. She looked around, more out of habit than actual concern. Seeing no one around, she bent down and picked up one of the rubber mats lining the hothouse floor. A trap door was revealed, and Helen took a key from her pocket and unlocked the padlock. The space beneath the hothouse wasn't that fancy. When it was first created, it was simply to be used as a space for Mrs. Ramshorn to grow various fungi and mushrooms in a temperature-controlled environment that would be more hospitable for them. Once Mrs. Ramshorn died, Helen thought the hothouses would be torn down. The groundskeeper was pleasantly surprised when Scylla, half crazy with grief and out of her mind, thanks to a steady supply of booze and drugs, made the decision that nothing was to be touched. It would be allowed to remain, and the flora to grow in whatever way it naturally would. Miss Ramshorn would live on in a cornucopia of poisonous and potentially lethal plants. Helen took advantage of the space, creating a little hideaway where she could work on her side project. It started simply enough with seeking out those plants she could use to make a profit. A little bit of purple haze was an easy sell. Then a little of her experiment mixes she sold to her usual customers. Of course, the mushrooms were one of the most popular items, and not just the psychedelic ones. Miss Ramshorn had some rare edibles that sold for quite a pretty penny. The groundskeeper had worked hard and did her research to keep certain plants thriving while allowing others to die. The overgrowth of vines provided a perfect cover and made the hothouse and her hideaway seem abandoned. Over the years, she's made several little improvements to the place. That included putting in a little generator to supply the underground room with electricity and heat for the winter months. Since she had small plants and the work area was small, one generator was enough to power the heat lamp she needed. She wasn't sure where the idea had come from. If she was honest with herself, it was probably from watching a rerun of Criminal Minds while she was tripping. Or it was when Garrett had shown her a couple of crazy fan mail letters he'd opened. That's probably what started it all. It was then Helen put the idea into action and created her first little gift to give to Scylla. It really had started out as just a thing to do. The idea was something to maybe freak the musician out, get her unsettled, get her to come to her for comfort. But then the note on the limo came, and Helen just kept creating the dolls, mimicking the letters Garrett had shown her. When the bitch bodyguard was hired, it suddenly became a game. She'd make a fool of the blonde, and the FBI, and the bodyguard, and have Scylla running to her for comfort. She made her way down the wooden steps, pausing when her phone buzzed in her shirt pocket. She didn't recognize the number, but it was local, so she answered. "Miss Graves?" "Helen," she responded, walking over to the makeshift work area. "I work for Jason. He said you had a job that requires some discretion and urgency." "Yeah," Helen answered. "When can you get started?" The groundskeeper took a seat at the workbench and looked down at the unfinished doll. A stock of magazines were off to the side, most still covered in their plastic wrapping. "I can come over today about 3 to make an initial estimate for you." "Can you come later than that?" Helen asked. She'd rather wait until after most of the day's staff ended their shifts for the day to hopefully prevent Isadora from finding out about her little accident. "Will around 8 work?" "Sure, if you don't mind coming out that late." "No, I don't mind. Jason may charge you extra, though, for an after-hours call." "That's no problem. Jason and I have an arrangement about the costs." A laugh echoed in Helen's ear, and something about it made the groundskeeper shiver. "Yeah, Jason informed me of the extra perks of this particular job. He said that you tip very well." "Yeah, I do," Helen said. She gave the mechanic the address and the particulars about coming around to one of the back gates instead of entering the front of the property, and ended the call. As she put on a pair of latex gloves and picked up one of the magazines and an X-Acto knife, she thought about the mechanic. His voice sounded oddly familiar. Theo prepared for the work ahead, placing notepads and little magnetic measuring strips inside the canvas bag he used when doing estimates away from the shop. He hesitated, peering into the bag, and then decided. He put the gun in an interior zip pocket. It is time. Time to pack. God has provided a path to the heathens. Time for the devil to make peace with the inevitable. Her death. Oh, there it is again. Father. Yes, Father. I have... Don't rush me. I must be insane. Father says I'm not. Stay on mission. Yes, yes, yes. Don't talk to me like that. I'm not a child. I am ready to find my father a new home. I cannot escape his voice, always there. I know what I am to do, but he can't leave me. Not yet. Theo knew it was his father providing the extra strength he needed to avenge his brother. His father had wanted Scylla Ramshorn to pay for what she had done, killing his son, Theo's older brother. Father had passed the responsibility to him as he became too sick to complete his mission. Their mission. Father, you have to be patient. I know what I'm doing. Just trust me. The insolence from the witch's whole crew will blind them. None of them are worthy. The pressure deepened, his head beginning to hurt. He felt his father's anger, the desire to kill the witch overwhelming him. Soon, Father, soon. I will kill her coven, and then I will kill the witch. Riel packed her bags in her room and added a few items from the gun safe. Once she felt she had everything she needed to leave the next day, she made her way up the stairs to Scylla's bedroom. She found the musician near the foot of the bed, rifling through one of her duffel bags. "Missing something?" Riel asked. Scylla looked up at the blonde, her eyes filled with surprise. On seeing the woman she loved, her expression darkened, and she put down the bag that she had been rummaging through and shook her head. "Just you?" Scylla answered, dropping her head and biting the corner of her lip. In truth, She didn't want Rael to know that she'd been packing her things. She loved Rael, and she had no intention of the blonde leaving her here. She planned to get a flight back home as soon as the blonde and her friend's plane had left the tarmac. "Hey, what is it?" Rael walked towards the musician, seeing the look of those blue eyes. She wanted to comfort her as best as she could. She could understand this would not be easy with the circumstances, that she was leaving Scylla, that Ray was going to be chasing after a psycho. Every part of Rael wanted to stay in this hideaway with Scylla forever, but she wanted the woman that she loved to be able to move forward. What had happened at the pond had haunted her for so long, and it wasn't her fault. Until the psycho was caught, she'd be trapped. Rael gently grasped at Scylla's wrist and looked deep in her eyes. "Syl, we are going to get this guy. I'm not going to let anything or anyone hurt you anymore." "What would hurt me most was if something happened to you," Scylla admitted. "What?" The bodyguard straightened her shoulders and attempted to look confident, but she knew by the expression on Scylla's face that the musician saw past the facade. The brunette reached out and stared deeply into her true love's eyes. There were no words needed. Rael knew that the musician was scared. Hell, even she felt worried. It was at that moment when the blonde lowered her eyes and stepped back towards the door to close it, hearing the door click as it shut. A petite, slender hand reached out from behind the bodyguard to the lock of the door and secured it. Rael smiled as she turned to face the musician, her arms reaching out to encircle the musician's waist. "I am glad we were on the same page on one thing," Scylla smiled, pressing her body against the blonde. She leaned in, and with her lips she found Ray's. Her eyes took in her lover before shutting tight, as if her emotions, her body, was trying to record this moment. Rael felt the change, the passion behind Scylla's embrace, the taste of her kiss. She couldn't let this moment pass. The blonde could just whisper, "You are so beautiful." Scylla could not help herself and kissed Rael with such intensity that everything else just melted away. The musician ran her hands on the raised shirt, gliding her fingers over her ribcage. Her thumb grazed the bottom of the bodyguard's breast. Rael took her jacket off and dropped it on the floor. This allowed for the musician to take off her shirt that was restricting access to the body she craved, that she ached to feel. She pushed her chest up against Rael. The friction of the musician's shirt against the blonde's skin sent goosebumps running over her body. The blonde reached for the musician's shirt, hands slipping underneath the material, fingers grazing the sensitive skin. She heard Scylla's breath hitch and leaned in to capture her lips. They stood like that for what seemed like forever, soft kisses and gentle caresses slowly increasing in intensity until Rael was pushing her lover closer to the bed. They may not be able to control what would happen in the future, but they had this moment, and they were not going to waste it. "You did really well today," Porter commented as he handed the artist a glass and took a seat beside him on a stool near the easel and Smoky Bear. Byron looked up from the canvas he was touching up and accepted the glass from the security guard's outstretched hand. His own still had the slightest of tremors, and he bit his lips. "I don't think I'll ever get completely comfortable with guns again." Porter watched as Byron turned back to the canvas and made a brushstroke here and there, not only adding another layer of paint, but also adding more depth and dimensions to the image of himself. After a moment he nodded. "You know, I think that's okay. I don't have to like them, just be able to use them, right?" Byron said, repeating the older woman's words with a smile. "Yeah," Porter answered in reassurance. "I just wanted to add, you were amazing with the first aid stuff." "You weren't so bad yourself," Byron said. He sighed and shook his head. "I know it's important to know all that stuff. I just hope we never have to put any of it into use." "Me too," Porter agreed. "Because that would mean someone was hurt, and I don't want anybody getting hurt." His eye turned from the canvas and met the artist's gaze. "Especially someone I care about." Byron gave a slight smile and nodded before sighing again. "I don't like this plan Rael has with her FBI friend." "I don't either," Porter agreed. "I can't believe Scylla just accepted it." Byron shook his head. "I don't think she did. But she said. She also stayed behind instead of going out with us. How much do you want to bet she went up to the room and started packing?" Porter's head tipped to the side for a moment as he thought about his friend. That would be more like her personality. Scylla would have said whatever was needed to pacify the bodyguard and then make plans to return to the mansion and catch up with her. Maybe we should do the same, then. I'm not letting her go back without help. Byron stood up from his stool and nodded. Sounds like a good idea to me. Porter smiled as he watched the artist put away his tools, and together they headed back to their rooms, both scurrying quickly to pack, wanting to be ready to go at a moment's notice. Theo parked his white 2001 Toyota Camry in front of the gate to the Ramshorn's property and peered at the entrance to the witch's inner sanctum. He had made multiple drive-bys over the last several months, and he had noticed the workmen making upgrades. He put his window down so he could speak with the person inside the security booth, and as he waited, he took in the other changes. Theo had been worried about how he would get by the advanced security, but as his father had promised him, God had provided a way in the form of an inside source. And what a source it was. It truly was providence that this particular coven member would be the one to allow him access to the witch. He tapped his fingers just on the outside of the driver's door and looked this way and that. Where was the person manning the boot? He tried to squint to look inside the little booth, but the glass had been tinted. A moment later the gate began to swing open on its own, and with a grin, Theo closed the window and put the car into drive. Anticipation building, he followed the winding road towards the mansion in the distance. As the beat-up and partially rusted white Toyota pulled to a stop just beside Helen, the groundskeeper frowned. Was this really the best Jason could do? If the man's own car was an indication of his skills, then she'd been suckered by the mechanic. Theo smiled at the groundskeeper, who had her hands on her hips and wore a scowl on her face, as he got out of his car and slammed the door. "You must be Miss Graves," he said, coming around to the passenger side of the car. "Helen," the groundskeeper said automatically. She didn't really care what this guy called her as long as he could fix the car. It had just become routine, Scylla and her first name rules. "Well, Helen, I'm Theo." The mechanic opened his passenger door and removed a large black canvas bag from the floorboard. He slammed the door shut and turned to Helen with a grin. "Where's the patient?" Helen started to repeat, puzzled. "Oh, the car." The groundskeeper gestured behind her. "It's in the garage." "Well, let's not keep her waiting." Helen's brows furrowed at the mechanic calling the car a her, but started to turn her body towards the garage. She didn't want the man walking behind her, though. Something about him made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Instead, she waited until he'd taken a couple of steps, and then motioned him on to go in front of her. Once inside the garage, the mechanic was all business. He thoroughly examined the car and took pictures of the damage with his phone. Reaching for his bag again, he slipped his hand inside, hand brushing against the inner pocket that held the gun. His hand froze for a second, thinking how easy it would be to just kill the coven member right now, but then pulled out a notebook and pen and began to scribble notes about the car. "What do you think?" Helen asked when the mechanic had finished his notes. "I think you're lucky that the parts I need should be easy to get. No way around the paint job, though. I'm going to have to repaint the whole thing. You want me to do that here, or do you want it to go into a shop?" "Say you want it done here," he thought. Helen put an arm on the back of her neck, a frown on her face. She hadn't thought about the car needing a complete paint job. There was no way that could be done at the house without someone noticing it. Maybe I should just take it into the shop. Theo began packing his things away and nodded. He didn't want to come off as desperate, but he needed to have a reason to keep coming to the witch's lair. "Sure, won't be able to fit it in for a couple more weeks, though. So the paint job's a maybe? What about the body work? Want me to do the work here?" Helen nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think that would be good." Theo smiled. "Good. I can come by tomorrow evening and get started. Same time work for you?" Helen found herself returning the smile and nodded. "Sounds great." The groundskeeper walked Theo back out of the garage and over to his vehicle. As he drove away, she still thought he sounded familiar. The more she considered it, the more she realized he also looked like someone she thought she knew. Maybe she'd figured it out when he came back by tomorrow. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.